So as you can see, the stencil's wiped off pretty easily. It's almost completely gone. But because I've marked in my shapes and shades, I've got everything I need to go back to. I'm not going to worry about wiping it off now. And that makes life a whole lot easier for me. I'm not stressing about wiping off the stencil. And it only takes 10-20 minutes. It's a bit like doing a hand stencil just on skin, and that is now permanent.
It does come off really easy on them fake skins, doesn't it?
It does.
In comparison to a person that would be there all day, but
like you were saying, if you were to leave it to dry for a couple of days, or if you just hair dry it for a bit longer, it does lock on well. But when you just stick it on and give it 10-20 minutes, like you would on a person, it wipes off really easily. But to be honest, I'm terrible for wiping off stencils, even on people. So I often mark them in like this, and then it's permanent for the rest of the day. I'm not worrying about it at all. The other thing is, if my client taps out, my stencil's there for next time. We're not reapplying, we're just getting straight into it.
And which grey tone are you using to map that in with?
So I've mapped that in with the lightest tone. It's the light ink out of Yarsen's set. Sometimes I'll use medium, especially if I'm mapping stuff in which is going to be there for a different session. If I know I'm not tattooing it on that day, but I want to get the stencil on, I'll grey line maybe with a medium ink, and then it'll still be there for the next session weeks later.
Right, so what's next then? So you've got all the grey lines in. What needles?
So marked my grey lines in, and what I tend to do now is I start putting lines in, and I start putting my blacks in. I always do my black first. A lot of tattooists tattoo light to dark, which there's nothing wrong with if that works for them. But personally, I tattoo the other way around. I like to get all my black in first. I like to get all my contrast in. Make sure it's fully saturated. Personally, I find if I work from light to dark, sometimes I don't put enough black in, and it might look dark enough on the day, but healed it lightens up a lot. Whereas if I make sure I've put all my blacks in first, I tend to find that, you know, it doesn't lighten up when it heals.
So is there any particular order in where you will start on a tattoo?
Not too. Once I've got it roughed in, not too much. Like I say, I just start by putting in my lines and my solid edges. Even with realistic tattoos, I do like to put in as many lines as I can. I find it's structure. It's what helps it age, helps it hold together. So this is a 3-liner, which for something quite small and realistic like this, I find perfect, and I almost never go smaller than a 3-liner. I also tend to run at quite a low voltage for small liners. I find especially with a 3-liner, if you run it at a higher voltage, it's very easy to blow out, to put too much in a small area. Whereas I find running quite slow, this is on 7.5 volts, whereas for shading I might run at 9 to 10 volts.
And would that vary depending on what needles you use? Do you change the volts?
Yeah, somewhat, but the main reason I go up or down in voltage is my hand speed. So when I'm pulling small, slow lines like that, I'll run at a lower voltage.
And what would be the higher volts that you would use?
So the higher volts I'd use, I'd go up to sort of 9 or 10 when I'm shading.
And do you feel that's because you're moving faster and you're more confident?
Yeah, so
style?
Instead of pulling a really slow line like that, with shading I might be sort of whipping faster movements, and if you don't run at a faster speed you'll get a lot of choppiness, a lot of needle marks.
And with your style, like I talk about this a lot in my tutorials, I like to kind of work off the tip and pepper the shades in. And I know you do a little bit of colour as well. I mean, with your style, do you tend to work off the tip, or do you tend to sink the needles and colour?
So I tend to work more off the tip, my needles hanging out a little bit. Especially lining and picking out small details.
And would that be with the shades as well? If you were using a mag?
If I was using a mag, I'd have the needle hanging out not quite as far. Sorry, I got lost with what I was saying there.
Yeah, so if you were using a mag, do you tend to work off the tip with the shades, or would you sink that?
What you mean, the Vaseline helps, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, so with a mag, I tend to hang the needle out a little bit less than I do with, say, lining or stippling. But I still don't generally sink to the tube, so I'm still brushing the skin with the needles as opposed to sticking it in and colouring.
So how long have you been tattooing now? I think we started around the same time, didn't we?
Yeah, I think we did roughly. So I'd say it's about 12 years, something like that.
Yeah.
Roughly.
Do you feel like a lot's changed in the industry since we started?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the industry was already changing fast when we started, but it's only continued to change and grow and develop since then.
I feel like it was really hard to get into when we started. It was a hard opportunity to get, and
it was. I mean, you know, the traditional way to go about it is an apprenticeship in a studio, but they weren't easy to come by. You know, even if you were a good artist, it was hard to find that opportunity, especially in a good, reputable studio. There's a lot of studios that were just out there to take advantage. Finding a studio that would actually give you a good apprenticeship and teach you the values that you need, it was a bit harder to come by.
I think that was quite important when I started, and especially the people who taught me or who I was around and learned off being decent people.
Yeah, and I think not limiting yourself too much as well, getting out and doing conventions and or even just going to conventions. It's a big eye opener. You know, there's so many different ways to approach the same things, but that isn't to say that there isn't wrong ways of doing it as well. And something that a lot of people end up doing when they start out is they'll buy a kit and start teaching themselves. They'll start tattooing themselves, or they'll start tattooing their mates and stuff like that. And I know some great tattooists out there, people who've done really well for themselves, have got to do fantastic tattoos, they've got hundreds of thousands of followers, and they started just tattooing their mates in a bedroom. And I'm not an advocate for that at all, mainly because it's not very sanitary, and you're gonna fuck up a lot of people's skin before you start doing good tattoos. So personally, I think the best way to learn is under someone's guidance, a decent apprenticeship. But like I say, they're hard to come by, so that forces people into looking for other ways to get the foot in the door.
Yeah, I see that. I feel like it is very hard to find a nice studio or even just somewhere decent. I mean, I can see how these people struggle to get the opportunity or find a nice studio.
Yeah, I mean...
What would you recommend for someone getting into tattooing then, like, who've got a portfolio into art, want to get into tattooing?
So personally, I would recommend trying to find an apprenticeship, approaching reputable studios that are within your reach, within your travel, how far you're willing to travel and stuff like that. And make sure you have a strong portfolio of artwork, and show that you have a keen interest in tattoos. You know, go to some conventions, make sure you get some tattoos by people you like, even get some tattoos from the studio that you're inquiring with. It's better than just turning up without a portfolio and asking them to teach you a trade that, you know, they don't know who you are, they know nothing about you. Even if you are a good artist, why should they teach you their trade? You know, you need to give them a reason.
Sounds obvious, doesn't it? But I haven't seen many people actually go about it in that way.
No, I mean, a lot of people, myself included, when I first started out, I just started emailing and asking around. And if you're lucky to get a response, and if you do get a response, they're probably going to tell you to try a bit harder, put together a portfolio.
Yeah, most tattooists are very busy and very useless, aren't they, with that kind of a side of things?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, you've got to give them a reason to want to take you on, teach you the trade.
This is quite a hard question, but what do you think set you apart from other people? How have you done so well, and what's the difference between you and any other person that does black and grey?
So one of the first things that springs to mind is, and this is a good thing and a bad thing, I can be a bit of a perfectionist. So I'm my own worst critic. If I feel like I could have done something better, I'll beat myself up about it, and I'll make sure it is better next time. And I'll take my time and I'll do it to the best of my ability. I'm not doing it as fast as possible for a good picture or to earn better money. I'm taking my time and I'm doing it to the best of my ability every time. The way I see it, people come to me because they see my work online, they see my work in person, and they expect a certain standard. And I don't want to give some people 100% and other people 80%. I want to give everybody 100%. It is weird, the fake skin, isn't it? It's like probably the first time I've really used it.
Yeah, I was just about to say that. Is that the first time you have tattooed on fake skin?
Yeah.
So when you first started tattooing, do you tattoo your friends or yourself, or?
So when I started tattooing,
I don't think that was a thing when we started fake skin, was it?
Barely. I think there was a couple of products on the market that weren't very good, so people were still tattooing fruit and pig skin and stuff like that to try and learn the basics. The way I started to learn the basics, and I wouldn't recommend this, but originally when I started with an apprenticeship, and my mentor would put me on his tattoos. So he would say to his client that his apprentice was, you know, learning, and didn't mind if I do a little bit. And I wouldn't say it's the best way to learn, getting thrown in the deep end and potentially making fuck-ups, but it's a make it or break it situation, and fortunately for myself I got it together and started getting better pretty quick. But I've also seen people, like very competent artists, quit because they've been sort of thrown in the deep end in the same sort of situation. It's been a bit overwhelming for them, it hasn't gone as planned, and they end up quitting, they decide it's not for them.
I do notice though, people who are going to be very good are normally quick learners, and I couldn't see you doing a bad one at the start either, and I kind of felt the same. I got chucked in at the deep end because that was the only option, and yeah,
I think you either start getting better quickly or you quit.
Yeah.
And like I say, I've seen good artists quit because they've been thrown in at the deep end.
I think the main thing that I noticed that really helped me was doing smaller stuff that I could knock out the park rather than trying stuff that's well too complicated. I mean, I don't think
100%.
Even now I like to do stuff like that I can put my full efforts and style into.
Yeah. So I'd 100% agree with that.
You see people doing portraits after a couple of months now, and
yeah, don't run before you can walk. I think even for realism tattooing, you've got to learn the foundations first. You've got to learn the basics. You should know how to saturate solid without overworking the skin. You should know how to line. Like you say, you shouldn't be attempting portraits if you can't do a clean, small tattoo first. I had an apprentice in the past, really talented guy called Wayne Fisher, who, if you look him up, he does fantastic black and grey, really good realism.
He's a good laugh as well, isn't he?
He's a good laugh, he's a funny guy, and he also does really solid old school tattoos. He really does have the traditional aspects of tattooing down. He's good at both. And the way, I mean, Wayne used to say he couldn't draw a stick man when he started, and I don't take credit for how good he is at all. He pushed himself, but the way I started Wayne off tattooing was he started learning on fake skin, and at first he just did things like Chinese symbols, little tribals, you know, really small basic tattoos, and the goal was to not move on until they were really clean and solid. And once he was doing things like that solid on skin, he started doing them on friends and family, people who were willing to get them for free while he was still learning. And he did things like Chinese symbols for the first month or two, and until they were nice and clean, he didn't move on to anything bigger.
That sounds like the right way to go about it. It
yeah,
sounds
and
like
just,
the way I wish I'd gone about it.
You take a step up when you're confident that your tattoos are solid and you don't run into it. You know, if you're not pulling good lines, you don't just try and do portraits.
Yeah, that's exactly the way I wish I'd gone about it when I started. I feel like you couldn't go too far wrong.
Yeah, I mean, you know, sometimes being thrown in the deep end does work wonders, but also sometimes it puts you in a situation where you're going to mess up people's skin, you're going to knock your confidence. It can result, you know, in you quitting and not wanting to get into the industry anymore.
So have you got an apprentice at the minute then?
I don't. I've only really ever had one apprentice, and then that was Wayne. And I wouldn't even say Wayne had a proper traditional apprenticeship. I was still fairly inexperienced. I hadn't had an apprentice before, and Wayne taught a lot of things himself just by hanging around the studio, watching what we do, asking questions, pushing himself, doing a lot of drawing, doing a lot of practice on fake skin. It wasn't like I was constantly over him, teaching him everything he knows. I just set him off in the right direction, made sure he stayed, you know, on the right track, and he taught himself the rest. And that's generally how it goes. It's good to have a mentor there to keep you right, but a huge part of tattooing is just experience. You've just got to spend time on skin learning.
Yeah, I feel that when I was learning to tattoo, if I didn't ask the questions, I would still be at the same place now. I don't think anyone's going to just tell you and push you through it. I feel like that's a thing that you need to be doing yourself when you're in there.
Yeah,
asking, learning.
You need to be self-motivated. You need to have a strong desire to get better, to get good. It's not something someone can do for you.
And how do you feel about, like, you obviously are quite well known for portraits and realism, but how do you feel like people get their style or find their style? How did you find yours?
So, me doing portraits, realism, generally comes down to me. It's what I'm good at. So before I was tattooing, I was drawing portraits with pencil and stuff like that, and it's just where it was my strong point when I started out. I was good at that kind of stuff, so it generally makes sense to do more of what you're good at, stick to it. And I kind of started building a name for myself for realism and portraits. So after a while, you know, people were coming to me for that kind of work, and before long it was 90% of what I was doing.
Do you find now that your work's changing over the years as you're tattooing? Because I do notice you put quite a lot of lines in stuff now, and you do tattoo a little different than what I remember you tattooing.
Yeah, definitely. I still feel like I'm learning and improving year in, year out. There's never a year that goes by where I don't feel like I'm that slight bit better than I was the previous year. And I think that's important. You should always be trying to improve and learn from what you're doing. And like I said before about a lot of it coming down to experience, these are things that you don't just learn overnight from a course or an apprenticeship. You've got to see your work come back healed, you've got to learn from it, you've got to make mistakes, you know, you've got to do things wrong to learn to do it right. And having a mentor can help stop you from making, you know, real fuck-ups. But when it comes to your everyday tattoos, you've just got to learn from the little things. Seeing your healed work really helps. I very much tattoo for a good heal and not a good picture on the day. And that's something, you know, you don't know how your work's going to heal when you're in your first year or two of tattooing. You know, you've only ever seen, if you have seen your healed work, it's only short term, you haven't seen it after a couple of years. So I've changed the way I do things. When I first started doing realism, I barely picked up a liner. Some tattoos I would completely mag, I would never use a liner. And that was because I didn't see the necessity for lines at the time. And I also wasn't very confident with my lining, so I stuck to mags more. But over the years, as I've seen more and more of my work healed, I've learnt that lines are really good for giving it crisp definition, especially when it's healed and when it's aged for a little while. You know, having some thin lines in there just gives you a nice edge that holds up well over time, which isn't strictly the case. You know, if you do your lines wrong, if you hammer them in too hard, they might look nice and black and crisp on the day, but when they come back healed, they'll be fatter, and that can really mess up a realistic tattoo when you're doing lots of fine details. If all those little lines blow out during the healing process, or even over a couple of years, the tattoo will start to blob and lose a lot of its definition. So you know, you've got to make sure you're applying your lines properly. On top of that, I used to use a lot of black to create contrast, and sometimes I would use a lot of black because I wasn't using lines, so having a lot of black and a lot of contrast kind of makes up for the lack of lines. But sometimes you'll notice with healed pieces that it doesn't have the same definition as if you were to put some lines in there just to keep it crisp.
I notice now you're putting up quite a lot of more traditional style pieces on your Instagram. Is that something you're wanting to do more of?
Yeah, so like I say, when I started out, I used to do everything, you know, anything that came into the studio, from names to butterflies to old school to neo-trad to Japanese to realism. But as I was saying earlier, what I started building a name for was realism. When I started doing portraits and stuff, that's what people started coming to me for. And you tend to find that you can almost end up a bit boxed in. People expect a certain style from you, so it's what they come to you for, and you end up doing only that style. But recently I've quite enjoyed doing a bit more drawing, especially stuff with a bit more traditional aspects to it, you know, more lines. I guess it's neo-trad really, but neo-trad does vary massively. And it's something I would like to do a bit more of, just mixing up the styles that I do, rather than doing realism 100% of the time. If you really want to focus and get good at something in particular, like realism, then it is good to do mainly realism for a few years or so and really refine your skills. But I feel like I'm at a point in my career now where I would quite enjoy mixing it up a bit, doing some other styles. So because I'm running my machine really low here, it's almost like stippling as opposed to lining. If I do a fast pass, you can see the dots, whereas if I do a slow pass, you get a solid line. So if I want to almost sketch in some details, I'm not going to overwork the skin because the machine's running really low, and I can just feather them in with the tip, and I can go a little bit heavier and a little bit deeper if I need to. But if I want to put in a solid line, I'll just slow myself down and go that little bit deeper. It's another thing to keep in mind when you're learning. If you do tattoo on fake skin, it isn't the same as real skin. It's good to refine your skills and get used to hand movements and whatnot, but it isn't the same. For a start, for a start, fake skin doesn't bleed, doesn't get swollen, it doesn't get overworked, doesn't move, and it doesn't quite go in the same either. It's about as close as you're gonna get without tattooing someone, but it definitely is different. So, you know, just because you can do a good tattoo on fake skin doesn't necessarily mean you can do good tattoos on skin. And I think that's where a lot of people kind of go wrong. They think that they can teach themselves on fake skin and then just get into tattooing, and it's not quite the same thing. It's almost, you know, fake skin is more comparable with other art mediums, whereas when real skin comes into the equation, it's a living canvas. It responds very differently. There's a lot more variables.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. If you did that skull on 5 different skin types, it'd be a different outcome every single one.
Absolutely, and to achieve a similar outcome, you would have to adjust the way you're tattooing for the skin type, which comes back to experience, knowing what changes to make as you go.
It's pretty bizarre tattooing something that's almost like it's healed instantly.
Yeah, it's quite strange. It's like I say, it's my first real go on fake skin. So
I found it really hard to get the ink in. Like it's a bit bizarre. It's completely different.
Yeah, I mean, so far I'm only really stippling and lining, but even with that, I can tell it's very different. Absolutely, like, you know, it's a great medium for teaching yourself the basics, for practicing things, for trying out new techniques and whatnot. But you know, if you haven't tattooed real skin, don't expect it to be the same.
I think what a lot of people say about the fake skin, and what I've found myself especially, is if you spent too long on that, then tattooed a person, you'd probably really overwork it.
Absolutely, like fake skin, you can keep going for quite a long time, and you're not gonna mess up your canvas. Real skin, you know, it can be overworked. At the end of the day, you're puncturing lots of little holes into someone's skin, and eventually, you know, too many holes is gonna hinder the body's ability to heal well, and you can end up with scar tissue, you can end up with keloids, you can end up with all sorts of problems, infection.
Yeah, it's very easy to overwork one tiny little bit, and that's the whole tattoo fucked, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I find it quite strange for trying a line on the fake skin.
Yeah, it's different. It's got its upsides and downsides. I really like. It's almost bizarre that it doesn't go red, and it doesn't blur and blend together as well.
Yeah, it's a bit more when it's in, it's in.
Yeah. I almost quite like the way when you're tattooing people that you can easily put your style, the inks blend together. On that, it's like you're using a marker pen.
Yeah, like one thing I tend to do with light tones in, say, a portrait or something realistic with smooth shading, to get good blends, I'll open up the skin with my lights and then blend my darker tones into it, and that'll achieve a nice blend. Whereas I'd imagine on fake skin,
not the thing on that, is it?
You just go straight in with your lights or your darks or whatever. You know, or it won't help to opening it up with.
Yeah, that's the thing I miss when I'm tattooing the fake skins, is little things like that, where it's not really, you can't get that same, them same things.
So I've put in some little lines and some definition there. I'm probably going to go in with a mag and start packing a bit more black.
Right, so we can see now on the video he's getting a lot of the black areas in, like he mentioned previously. How are you finding putting the black in on there?
So it is different to skin. You can't overwork it, but saturating it feels a little bit different as well. Even things like cutting into the edges and the corners with the edge of your mag, you know, you don't have to worry too much about overworking, which is, you know, could potentially teach you bad habits if you're learning on fake skin and then you go onto real skin. You might end up chewing up some areas of the skin because you're used to the fake skin being able to take it. So definitely something to be cautious of if you're transitioning from fake to real skin.
I think we spoke about that this morning, didn't we? About we wouldn't spend too long on the fake skin, and it is a lot different. You kind of don't want to.
Well, I mean, I've been tattooing, what were we saying, 12, 13 years now, and I think this is my first real go on fake skin. I've never done a full tattoo on it.
What would you use?
I think some people maybe do get caught up trying to learn everything on fake skin, and it's like you could get really good on fake skin and still be bad on real skin.
Yeah,
so,
quite easily.
I don't think you should get too focused on the fake skin. It's great for practicing techniques and whatnot, but it's definitely not the be all and end all.
I think for me, when I've used it, I do quite like it as almost like doing a bit of art. I don't really think of it as a tattoo as such. I mean, it's nice to practice new techniques on it, to be honest. And
I mean, if the reason you're using fake skin is because you're new to the industry, you're trying to teach yourself the basics, I wouldn't be attempting to do realistic tattoos and stuff on fake skin. You could do a little bit of practice, but I wouldn't get too focused on it because you're not going to be able to do it on real skin. You need to learn the basics on real skin before you start attempting stuff like this. So I would suggest using the fake skin for practice pulling your lines, practice getting the same consistency, practice saturating your shading and getting it smooth. Just techniques that you can then apply to real skin, and you'll notice the difference and you'll learn from it. You know, we were saying earlier you could do an amazing piece on fake skin and you know, still not have a clue how to do it on real skin.
yeah, I feel that in a lot of videos that I've done, I think it is more about the techniques and learning stuff on it. It's not about being able to do it on that and it means you can do it on a person. I think the two are completely different.
Yeah, they're similar. You can learn a lot from it, but as you say, they are very different. There's a lot more variables in tattooing real skin. Skin reacts very differently. The weird thing about fake skin is it doesn't really react. You can just keep going.
Yeah, there is no bounce, there is no react. It feels a bit dodgy actually on the tattoo machine, that there's no give. It's really...
Well, one of the major things is depth is much less important. You know, you can be tickling the surface of the fake skin and still be putting in shading, whereas when it comes to real skin, if you're just tickling it in the surface, it's just going to come out in the healing, or to get it saturated you're going to end up overworking the skin. It's one of the major factors with real skin is depth. You need to be able to adjust what you're doing. Like, you know, the skin on my forearm's different to the skin on my leg, and the skin on my leg's different to the skin on Luke's leg. And the only way you're going to learn about different skin types and how it responds to tattooing and how you need to change what you're doing is experience on skin. Doesn't matter how much practice you have on fake skin, you're not learning those things.
I think that's, yeah, and like what we said before, with doing stuff that you're comfortable and you can do really well and knock it out the park, small, not stuff that's too hard as well.
Yeah.
Because each place is going to be different.
I could see people getting very disheartened if they've had loads of practice on fake skin and they're doing some quite impressive artwork on it, but then they go to tattoo someone and find it very difficult. They can't achieve the same results as what they do on fake skin, and they don't know why.
Yeah, they want it on the neck or something like that. And
yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's tough parts of the body and stuff like that. You know, for people who are learning out there, don't expect to be able to do what you're doing on fake skin on real skin straight away. There is going to be a lot of differences that you need to learn as you go.
So what do you think are the real positives about the fake skin?
I think the major positives are practicing basic techniques without going straight onto real skin. So when you're learning to pull lines, when you're learning to do basic techniques like whip shading and whatnot, you don't have to do it on volunteers who are inevitably going to end up with bad tattoos. You can practice it on fake skin first, and then when it does come to doing it on some volunteers, you're less likely to really fuck it up, especially with a mentor looking over your shoulder, keeping you right.
And I know you haven't done any tattoos on any other fake skin brands or anything like that, but
I have done a little bit, just literally dabbling here and there, practicing techniques or showing someone else techniques.
How do you find that fake skin? That's the pound of flesh one.
So this stuff seems really good quality, really thick. Some of the cheaper stuff that I've bought in the past and dabbled on, it's quite thin. You can go through it quite easily. It's you struggle to saturate it as well without chewing it up and mangling it. This stuff seems really hardy. Like you can really pack black without worrying about damaging it.
So with tattooing then, have you always set yourself goals or anything like that? Is there anything you do to better yourself or you've done in the past that's helped you get to where you are?
I just never get too comfortable in my ability. I was saying earlier about being a perfectionist and my own worst critic, and sometimes that can be a bad thing because you can do a good tattoo and start comparing it to other people and get yourself down over it. But it can also be a good thing because you're constantly trying to up your game. You know, I'll often do a tattoo that I'm really happy with, but by the time I've gone home, looked at the picture a million times, I'm not as happy with it. I find all the flaws that I could have done differently. But that's a good thing because I will approach it differently next time. If there's anything I'm not 100% happy with, I'll try and learn from it and approach it differently in the future.
I think that's with a lot of people nowadays, and even when it comes down to posting the tattoo work, I've noticed a lot of people don't post nowhere near as much and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, it can also come down to how motivated you are to push your social media and to grow your audience and whatnot. When you're first starting out, you know, you're super keen to get your tattoos in front of as many people as possible. Whereas when you're more comfortable, when you've been tattooing a few years, when you've got a strong client base, you're not so much trying to, you know, you don't have the necessity to get your work out there as much. So it's easier to wind back and just post your favourite work.
Do you feel like that's the case for yourself? Do you not post as much anymore? And
I'm definitely not as active on social media as I used to be. That's partly just down to lack of motivation. I'm busy regardless, but I probably do need to put my finger out and keep on top of it a bit better. You know, people like seeing what you do, people like seeing your work and stuff, so it's good to put it out there and not get not get too what's the right word, too coy about putting stuff out there. You know, so you don't have to put out every tattoo, but every tattoo you should be doing it with the intention of it being good enough to put out there. You know, you shouldn't be rushing a tattoo just because it's not your cup of tea or anything like that. I thoroughly believe you should be giving everyone 100%, whether it's a little name, a simple flower or rose, a skull like this, or whether it's a portrait of someone's kid. You should be giving it 100%. You should be trying to do the best of your ability.
So what do you think for people starting out in regards to social media and the way to go about that? Do you think that's a really important thing nowadays, social media and tattooing?
So social media gets your work in front of potential customers. Very few people take out adverts in magazines and stuff like that anymore. The most likely way people are gonna see your work is online through social media. So inevitably, when you grow in your business and you're trying to find clients, it is a very important tool. And I would definitely recommend trying to be fairly consistent with it early on. If you're only posting once a month, like I sometimes do now, you're not going to get the engagement that you would if you were posting regular. It's a bit of a snowball effect. Once you get the ball rolling, it's easier to keep going as long as you're putting out quality content. Whereas if you post once a month, even if it's a fantastic tattoo, it's not going to get the same engagement as if you're consistently putting stuff out. I think when you start out with social media, you need to be a little bit less fussy about what you post. You just need to do your best and get it posted and learn from it. And if you're only holding out to post your favourite tattoo every month or so, you're going to struggle to get the views and the engagement that you need to grow your client base. You know, even if it's just a little flower, you know, make sure it's a good little flower and get it put on your social media, and that can result in more clients.
Yeah, there's a lot to the industry nowadays, isn't there? Like, not just being good at tattooing, but being good at social media, being good at running a business, being good with customers. There's a lot of different aspects.
Oh, absolutely. I feel pretty confident now that I have a really strong client base, and I do get a lot of clients through word of mouth. They see my other clients get work, and then, you know, they want to book in and get work. And to be honest, I much prefer getting work that way than getting some stranger off social media. But both are as important as each other. You need to have a great online presence. But you also need to have a great real world presence. You need to keep your customers happy. You need to make sure... The thing about social media is you could be doing loads of tattoos that look great on the day, and you take a good photo, but they heal like shit. And, you know, you can be a good social media tattooist without being a good real life tattooist.
Yeah, you see a lot of that nowadays as well.
Yeah, I
People
mean,
coming in and wanting a sleeve done in a day because they've seen that online.
They've seen it online, and I'm an advocate for doing things to the best of your ability, taking your time and doing it right. There's a lot of people now that are trying to get loads done in a day because it makes for a good social media post, and it's a bit more exciting. But I know for a fact that you can't get that scale of work done without cutting corners. And if I'm not doing something as well as I possibly can, I'll beat myself up about it. You know, I always want to do the best of my ability, and I think it's served me well throughout my career. I've done all right with that attitude, and I'll carry on with that attitude.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And I think it's it's not nice to see all these sleeves done in a day either. Yeah.
I mean,
not good.
Don't get me wrong, if you can bash out a sleeve in a day and charge a couple of grand for it, it's gonna be good money. You know, better money than if you're charging a quarter of that for a portrait and it's taking you the whole day. But if you really want to be putting out good work and building a good reputation that stands the test of time, your tattoos need to be solid, and by that I mean they need to be more than just an Instagram post. They need to age well, they need to heal well. The goal should be that, you know, your tattoos still look good in 5 or 10 years, not just that picture on Instagram.
Yeah, I think when people see tattoos in real life, I don't think they're going to be impressed by how long it took. I think they're just going to look at it and judge the tattoo.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, if someone shows me a sleeve and it's not that great, I'm not going to think it's any better because they told me they got it done in a day. You know, a tattoo's on you for life, you know. And I saw someone post on social media recently, I can't remember who it was, but I had a lot of respect for what they said, and I completely agree with it. And they basically said that stop rushing tattoos because they're on people, they're on human skin, and you should treat it with the respect it deserves. You know, you're not just blasting something out for an Instagram post. You're marking someone's body for the rest of their life, and if you're not doing it as best as you possibly can, then you're selling them short.
So, have you got any future goals at the moment, or anything that you're concentrating on with the tattooing, or?
So my goals are to continue what I'm doing, i.e. I love realism and I love trying to better myself, and I love trying to constantly develop my understanding of tattoos and the way I approach them for longevity. But on top of that, I'd quite like to mix it up and tattoo in other styles a little bit more. It's been a long time since I've done colour or more traditional tattoos, so that's something I'd like to do a little bit more of. I think it's good to push yourself in other departments and not get too caught up in one.
Are you still enjoying the tattooing as much now as what you did when you very first started?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like with anything, there's ups and downs. Sometimes you're more motivated than others, but I think it's important to not get too complacent in your ability or what you're doing. If you think you know it all and if you think you've got nothing else to learn, you're gonna get bored. The quality of your tattoos is gonna suffer because of it. Whereas if you're constantly pushing yourself, if you're constantly comparing yourself to, you know, to what you see online, and something I've always done is I've always followed who I think are really good artists at that time, and I'll always compare myself to what I see online. You know, if I for example do a rose tattoo, I want it to be a really fucking good rose tattoo, and if I see rose tattoos online that I think are better, I'll question myself as to why. What could I have done differently to take mine to that next level, to make mine look as good as the ones that I think are top notch.
And as far as people getting into tattooing now, do you think it's harder for someone to get the name out there in the industry and stuff like that? Or do you think it's easier?
I think it can be harder and it can be easier. It all depends on how you look at it and how you approach it. There's more ways than ever to find clients, to get your work out there. Social media platforms. There's more information than ever to help you get better and to learn from. When we started, there was very little out there. You know, you couldn't go on YouTube and see people tattoo and learn good techniques that way. The industry had a lot of gatekeepers who did not like sharing information. these days there's so much content out there that, you know, there's loads of ways. You can go on YouTube, you can find other venues where not only can you find stuff that helps with your tattooing, but you can find stuff that helps with your photography, how you promote yourself on social media, your online presence, you know, all things that will really help you as an artist. But something you do have these days is it's a more saturated market than ever. There's more and more people getting into tattooing who haven't done before. More and more people who are, you know, artists first. And
I've seen where you are. There's probably like 100 studios where you are.
Yeah, I mean, when I first opened in Carlisle, we were the second tattoo shop. There was one other, and it was an old school shop that's been there for some time. It's got a decent reputation. Now in Carlisle, there's got to be probably 15 studios. Half of those studios, I don't know the name, I don't know the artists, but you know, there's some good talent amongst them. It's quite diverse, you know. Not all of them are good, but there is some really good artists there, and that's just a small town like Carlisle. You tend to find most populated areas now will have a handful of good artists to choose from, whereas in the past you'd have had to travel quite a long way to sometimes find someone that specialises in what you want.
Even in regards to the information, when I started, you'd have to travel to the other side of the world to a convention to learn some techniques, whereas now, like we're doing here, there's YouTube and you can just log on and see these different techniques.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, for better or for worse, there's more information out there and more tools at people's disposal than ever before. And it's up to people to take advantage of that and do it in the right way. But at the same time, there's more competition than ever. And if you're just getting into the industry now, there's going to be a lot of people in the same position, all competing to build their reputation, their client base, get better at what they're doing. You know, it's harder to make yourself stand out from the crowd. So I think that's why it's important to, you can't just be good at one thing. You've got to be able to promote yourself on social media. It's tough for an artist these days because it's not just about being good at tattooing, it's about being good at promoting yourself, it's about knowing how to run a social media platform. There's so many things that, you know, falls on an artist's lap that they have to do on a daily basis.
So if you took a guess at how you think the industry is going to go in the next 10 years, what do you think is going to happen? Do you think it's still going to be as busy? Do you think they're going to be as popular, tattoos? And
personally, I think that tattooing as an industry over the past 10 years or so has been somewhat peaking. It's more popular than ever. There's more people getting tattooed than ever before. There's more tattooists than ever before. More options than ever before. But I think, like I say, it's peaking. I think at some point it'll start to drop off somewhat. And I don't think it's good, solid artists that have a decent reputation and do good work for longevity that'll take the hit. I think it's a lot of the new artists who've not long got involved with the industry, and there's a lot of people out there who are getting away with charging good money for pretty average work, and I think they're going to realise that when the work starts drying up, they're hit first. But who knows? Like, people say, do you think tattoos will go out of fashion? No, I don't think they will. They've been around since pretty much the dawn of man. And generally things only go out of fashion because people stop wearing them, which, you know, is hard to do with tattoos. They're always going to be seen. I think definitely there's different trends of what's popular, you know, like whether it's realism, whether it's traditional, whether it's Japanese. There's always going to be trends that go up and down. But I think tattooing will always be around. You know, it might fluctuate, but it's never going to disappear.
So for someone starting out, would you recommend them getting the exact equipment you use, or would you recommend anything different? Is this any of this you feel is more advanced as you get into tattooing, or do you feel like as a beginner you would straight out buy exactly what you're using here?
As a beginner, I would very much put trust in your mentor. They're gonna try and direct you to the best of their ability, and if you follow their advice, you're gonna get better results. But as you start delving into more niche stuff, say you start to pursue realism and you start to try and teach yourself extra skills on top of the basics that you've learned. It's hard to say. I wouldn't say that you strictly need to follow certain rules. You need certain equipment. I'm using pretty good equipment here, but I know like this machine, for example, is several £100s. I know that I could buy a £30 Chinese eBay machine and do just as good of a tattoo. I'd have just as much confidence with it. What I wouldn't have confidence in is how long that machine's gonna last, how long the motor's gonna last. You know, those types of machines, they start to get rattly, they start to get noisy, they start to get inconsistent, and the motors tend to burn out pretty quickly. So I would definitely recommend that if you're really serious about getting into realism, if it's something you're gonna stick at, invest in some good equipment. By all means, you can practice on fake skin and stuff like that with some cheap equipment. But if it's something you're going to stick at and pursue for some time, quality equipment will last you, whereas cheap equipment won't.
Do you feel like with the tattooing that you've somewhat peaked, or do you reckon you will get a hell of a lot better?
I think that good question. As far as realism is concerned, I think that I wouldn't say peaked, but you get to a certain level where noticeable improvements slow down vastly. You know, when you're first getting into it, every tattoo you'll notice improvements, it gets you excited, it keeps you motivated. By the time you've been doing it 10 years or so, you know, you're not noticing so many differences, you're not noticing your work changing massively. But I still wouldn't say that I've peaked by any means, and I don't think I ever will. I don't know if everyone's the same, but for me, I always feel like there's ways to improve, things I could do better, things I could do differently. And I'm always thinking about those things as well. I'm never too complacent in what I'm doing. I think if you feel like you've peaked, if you get too complacent, then you will peak and you will see less improvements. You know, you need to have that desire to keep getting better.
So what's your tips and techniques on putting the black in? How do you find it best putting the black in?
So I like to put most of my black in first before I start any shading. That way I can really see whether I've got the saturation solid enough. I like to I like to make sure my blacks are 100% saturated before moving on to the shading, because the black is the bit that's gonna really hold up and stand the test of time best.
And what's your techniques for doing it?
So I always kind of keep the needle moving. You know, I'm never like chewing up one spot. I'm always moving it, and I tend to either sort of whip out from the edges, or if I'm colouring a bigger area, almost like a pendulum movement, sort of in and out, in and out, in and out, sort of whipping each side.
So you're not sinking the needles and colouring then when you're doing the black?
I don't tend to sink the needles, and I don't tend, with a mag, it's different with a round shader, but with a mag I don't tend to do circular motions. Circular motions like that,
which is commonly what everyone would normally recommend.
I tend to find you don't get the consistency, you get harsh edges when you're going sideways, and then you don't get enough saturation when you're going long ways. So what I tend to do is more of a back and forth, overlapping a little bit as you go. And that back and forth movement generally gets a more even saturation.
And do you use a mag a lot for the black, or does it depend on the piece?
I use a mag a lot for packing my blacks, and I'll also do a lot of the dark shading and a lot of the darker fades with pure black and a mag, and I find that then easier to blend back into with lighter shades.
And would this be the same if you're doing a portrait? Would you go about a portrait in the same way as you go about the skull?
I would, yeah. But something I would do slightly differently is I'd be less likely to go straight into tones in the face with pure black, because it generally does give you a bit more texture and a bit more roughness, whereas with a portrait you generally want it as smooth as possible for the skin tones. So normally with a portrait I would use a bigger mag to maybe do some lighter tones first and then blend a few darks into it. Whereas with a skull or something with a bit of texture, I'll happily go straight in with the blacks and start doing some of the darker shades by whipping out, and I don't mind a little bit of texture and a little bit of roughness.
So what's next then? So once you've got the black in, is that going to be light shades, or is it going to be all the shades? Is there a certain order you do every tattoo with, or?
There isn't a strict order. Again, depending on the piece. So maybe with a skull, I'll go straight into some dark shading and build up some of those tones. But with a portrait, I might do some light tones first, just to open up the skin and build up that softness. Depends how smooth I'm trying to achieve.
But in general, you'd always do the black first?
In general, I'll always do the solid black and my lines first. The really dark shading, the sort of black whip shading, I'll sometimes mix it up a little bit with like a skull or a piece where I don't mind a bit more texture, I'll just go straight into it. With a portrait, I'll maybe open up the skin and build up the tones a bit more, just to try and get the smoothest results possible for the skin tones.
And this is the part we're up to now, so you've done all the black. Is this kind of like
so
the dark greys and bits you can have fun with?
At the moment, I've done most of the solid black, and I'm building up some of the dark greys and some of the textured areas just with straight black. If I don't want it to be too dark, I'll just do some quick passes. I won't spend as much time saturating it solid. Always kind of keeping the needle moving and whipping out to get softer edges.
Do you find yourself working completely off the picture with something like this, or do you always try and put your style into it? I mean, with any textures or details, do you work closely to the picture, or once you've got the black, do you find you put a bit more your style in? Or
so with realism, I tend to work pretty close to the picture, especially with portraits and things of that nature. I'll stick very, very close to the picture. Sometimes I'll almost imagine myself a bit like a human printer. You know, people often say, "Oh, how do you do portraits? It's so hard." And I don't really see it that way. I'm just copying. That's all I'm doing. I'm just copying what I see, using the techniques that I know and I've learned to replicate what I'm seeing in the reference. Other black and grey stuff like skulls, roses, you get a bit more freedom with it. You don't have to stick identical to your reference. You can mix up the textures. You can mix up the shading a little bit. You can boost it in places or hold off in other places. But with portraits, I'll very much stick to my reference. Unless I don't think my reference is well suited to being tattooed for some reason. Maybe there's an edge which is a little bit more light or something like that, and I know it won't hold up over time. So I'll maybe boost the contrast in places and stuff like that. But again, with portraits, I'll any changes to the contrast or you know, if I can change in any areas because I don't think it's very well suited to being tattooed, I'll usually do that with editing software before I start, so that I'm not just winging it whilst I'm tattooing, because there's very little room for error with portraits. You know, very slight changes can make it look like a different person. It can make it look not quite right. You don't get the same freedom that you get with other subject matters like skulls and roses and everything else.
so obviously some people would recognise your style and that it's your tattoo. What do you feel that makes it different, your work compared to other people's black and grey? What makes it your style?
Good question. I've never really felt like I've particularly got a style. For most of my career, I've concentrated on realism, and I thought on the actual tattoo itself, I just focus on doing it to the best of my ability, trying to get it as close as I can to my reference material, but also keeping in mind what makes a good tattoo, i.e. what's going to look good over time, what's going to age well, what isn't, and I'll try and make changes that'll make it better suited to being a tattoo and standing the test of time.
So have you never really focused on getting a style, it's more just come to you?
Yeah, absolutely. I've never focused too particularly on having my own style or anything like that. I've just focused on doing good quality work, and that's kind of led to my work having a bit of a pattern through it, I guess. But I'm not looking to put my stamp on it really. I'm just looking to do it as well as I can. What I think makes a good tattoo.
Yeah, I guess, well, doing realism myself, I think that would be the same answer that I'd give. And yeah, it's quite hard when you think about it, especially the style, or when you do realism, you just try and do it good.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there is artists out there that have a very notable style. You recognise their work a mile off. I've never really felt like I've got that. But like you say, some people would recognise my work purely on the way it's been done, the way I've approached it, the things I've put focus onto. And something else that I put a lot of effort into with my realism that I don't think some artists do, or I think some artists neglect a little bit, is composition and placement. So both with the design and on the human body. You know, you can do a really good tattoo, but if you slap it on somewhere on the body where it doesn't look well placed, it doesn't look like it fits the area, it can still look a bit naff, even if the tattoo is really well done. I'll often spend a lot of time resizing my tattoo at the start of the day, tweaking the stencil, reprinting it, resizing. I'll hold it up, you know, 5 or 6 times if I need to make sure it looks like it's going to fit that area well and the placement looks good. And then I'll apply the stencil, and if I need to, I'll clean it off and do it again if I'm not happy. I don't just slap it on and tattoo it. I think it's important that it fits the body well, it looks right where it is. And the composition of the design as well, when there's multiple like right now I'm just doing a skull, but when there's multiple elements making up a design, maybe 4 or 5 things that have been put together to create a piece, it's important that you spend time making sure it looks good, making sure it looks right, trying different things. iPads are brilliant tools for realism artists because we can layer images together, we can try different things out before we start, and make sure we're happy with things like the composition and the way the design is put together.
Yeah, I've noticed similar. I think that's one of the most important things that I realised when I started tattooing is the layout on the body and making the design work, and that's what I got taught with my apprenticeship. And I have noticed, like you say, with a lot of these new artists that are popping up, studios, it's kind of apprentice learning apprentice, and a lot of them are doing sleeves and they've never learned the layout of doing a sleeve.
How to structure it.
And I think that's the big problem now.
I agree. I've seen very good realism artists who do great individual pieces, and they'll do a good piece there, they'll do a good piece there, they'll do a good piece there, but they don't know how to tie stuff together to make it into a piece, and they end up just filling the gaps with shading or black or something like that. They haven't learnt how to stitch things well so it looks seamless and effortless. And
that's a hard thing to learn.
It is, and it's something that kind of just comes natural from you know, experience and trying things and studying work of other people.
I think for me, when I learned off an artist that was more not traditional, but did a lot of like Japanese stuff with flow and layout that did do full sleeves.
Yeah,
and that's the prime example here of you can't just do realism then go and do a sleeve. You need to learn the foundations.
So many elements from other styles that you end up applying to realism. Realism is quite a young style. It was never really a thing until not long ago. When me and you started tattooing, realism was still a pretty new thing. You know, black and grey and stuff like that had been around a little while, but you know, what we now call realism and portraits and stuff like that didn't really boom until, you know, maybe 15 years ago max was when it really started taking off. And a lot of artists who were getting involved with the industry and doing realism were artists more than tattooists, and they weren't thinking with a tattooist's brain. They weren't thinking what age is well, how's the skin going to react, how's it going to hold up. how are we going to stitch it together, how are we going to get flow, stuff like that. They were just focused on doing a good realism tattoo, being a printer, being a copier, like I said earlier. And there's a limit to that. You know, you need to be able to take other areas of tattooing into consideration when you do realism. Like I say, something that's changed in my realism over the years is I put more lines into it. I actually use less black than I used to. I used to use lots of black because I thought without lines, black helps a tattoo hold up, which is somewhat true. But I've learned in recent years that a bit of a mix of both can achieve better results, especially for longevity. And now when I approach a tattoo, I generally try to, when I approach realism, when I approach black and grey in general, I try and do it what I call in a balanced way. So if you split it into thirds, I generally think it should be about a third black, a third shading and a third skin, and that creates balance. You know, if you oversaturate a tattoo, if you shade every little gap, it'll just end up a grey blob in a few years when it's healed, and when the blacks turn a bit lighter grey and when the grey's toned down a bit, it'll just all kind of blend together and be a bit muddier. It'll have less definition. Whereas when you put lines in and when you leave some skin on shore, it creates contrast, you know, which contrast holds up over time. It's what helps with longevity.
Yeah, I think that balance is really important. I've noticed that over the years you do veer off, going darker with your work or more lined with your work, and it's always trying to bring that right balance for what you're doing.
Absolutely, yeah.
I feel like that's been a really important thing with me, especially.
I mean, when I first started building a name for myself doing realism, and I used to do a lot of conventions, and I started winning a couple of awards, and I started getting a big following, and lots of other artists asking me for advice and stuff like that. Oh shit, I've completely gone off track. You're gonna have to delete that bit. You'll have to tell him that there's a fuck up there. I'll stick my fingers in front. Shit, what was I getting at? I was thinking about what I was doing on here and lost track. What were we just saying?
I think it's just about the longevity and finding that balance, like you spoke about then.
Oh yeah, yeah, I know where I was going with it. I'm back on track. Are you still rolling? Yeah,
well that's why these videos are good, because it's so raw. There's no bullshit. It is what it is. So it's not edited. It's not really fancy.
What I was getting at before I lost track, because I was trying to focus on the tattoo, was when I used to do a lot of conventions and I first started getting a name for myself for realism, people used to say I was really fast. They were like, oh, you get loads done in a day. Which now I almost feel like the opposite. Now I almost feel too slow, like I need to get more done. And I think by slowing myself down and not rushing, like my work, I get so, like my heels are way better, way better. Like, it used to be commonplace to do the occasional touch up, to do a second pass to get it right. Whereas now, almost every time I get it right. You know, I don't have to do touch ups, I don't have to do follow up appointments. It's one pass and it's solid, it heals well. And that's because I have slowed myself down. I make sure I saturate things properly, and by that I don't just mean my blacks, and I don't just mean putting lines in. You've got to saturate your shades properly as well. And where a lot of people cut corners and save time is they'll just shade really quickly, pack it in and move on, and you're not getting solid saturation. Like if you imagine if you tried to put black or colour in like that, it would be patchy as fuck. and the greys are essentially going to do the same thing. They're going to look patchy heeled, some bits are going to come out more than others. You're not going to have that smooth, solid, saturated look, which you can only achieve by taking your time and building it up properly.
I think as well it takes a lot of years to be able to work the skin to the point where you can do that as well. I feel when I first started, if I tried to...
Good point. If you tried to do that, you'd probably end up overworking it.
Yeah.
Yeah, you've really got to get a feel for skin, what it can take. You know, there's a big difference between properly saturating something and overworking the skin, but there's also a very fine line.
It's a very weird order of learning how to tattoo, and you're never quite right, you're never quite happy. There's always something you want to be doing, and I think that's why we keep coming back to, you can't do everything on this fake skin, and there is a process of doing all these different styles and learning the proper way, isn't there?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, personally, I think one of the best things for someone learning to tattoo, for someone new to the industry, is doing lots of small tattoos that vary quite a bit. Taking up like walk-ins, you know, it could be one tattoo could be doing a little name on someone's wrist, which by no means is an easy tattoo. If you fuck up those lines, it's going to be noticeable. They need to be.
I find that harder than that skull there.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no room for error. But people almost turn their nose up at it. They think, oh, I want to be a realism artist. I'm not going to do a name on someone's wrist. But if you can't do that name on a wrist, you don't stand a chance at doing realism properly. It's very important to really get good at the basics, like learn to walk before you can run. And I'm a little bit of a hypocrite because I had a lot of freedom with my apprenticeship. I started doing realism quite early on. I started tackling portraits probably after 6 months of tattooing, but I wouldn't recommend anyone else did that. You know, those portraits, I would look back at them now and I definitely would not be happy with them.
I think a lot of the time as well, it depends how fast of a learner you are. Some people you can push it into really fast, and others are very different ways of how people learn. It's
100%.
I feel like when we were learning, it was a pushing thing and go for it, and you were either gonna be good or not. Yeah.
Get thrown in at the deep end, and you either learn to swim or you sink. And you know, it can work. It's sort of an old school apprenticeship that can pay off. But the reason I don't recommend it is you don't want to go out there fucking up lots of people's skin trying to teach yourself to tattoo. In an ideal world, you want to minimise the amount of bad tattoos you do, and I think the best way to achieve that is having a mentor close by, keeping you right.
So are we now on the shades on this piece? Are you into the grey wash now?
So I've pretty much finished packing my blacks, but there's just a few little details and bits of texture that I've missed, but just a little bit too fine to do with my mag.
And is this the round shader or the liner?
So I've picked my 3 liner back up, and I'm just going back in, adding a few textures and edges where I need it before I start my shading.
See, I work very similar, and the one thing I like about doing it this way around is you almost don't need any shades for it to look like the finished piece. It's nice how it is.
This is something I always say. If it looks good with just the black, then you're kind of already onto a winner, because some of those shades are going to lighten up over the years. Some of those lights, you know, some people are going to go out, they're going to go on holiday, they're going to get lots of sun. Some of those light shades, some of those light details are either going to fade back or maybe even disappear completely. But the black is what's really going to hold up, what's going to stand the test of time. So if you can put enough contrast in, if you can make sure it looks pretty good with just the black, then the shading's only helping, it's just adding that extra realistic element. But the tattoo's got the solid foundations that it needs to stand up and hold the test of time. You get like weird build up as well, don't you?
Yeah, it's very cloggy on the Vaseline, isn't it?
I think it's like bits of plastic too.
How are you finding the shading on the fake skin?
Different, but not as bad as I thought. I thought it would be a lot rougher, like, you know, once it's in, and there's no, like, harder to blend. But it's kind of similar how you can build up the tones. Better than I thought it would be.
I found when I've tattooed the fake skins, you could spend as long as you want on them. You could come back, you could spend another 5 hours on it, and with the shades and building it up, and it's nice to have something to work on more and more. Whereas on tattooing real people, it's very limiting.
Yeah, definitely. I find when you tattoo on real skin, and it's a common mistake you see with people when they start with black and grey, you can overuse the light shades, and you know, by going over and over and building up saturation, it can appear a lot darker than what it actually is, and then when it heals up it'll go back to being really light. Whereas I'm finding with the fake skin, it's not as easy to just oversaturate with the light. Like, it does feel light. I feel like I need to go up to make it darker, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I noticed that. No, I totally do. Yeah, like if you want dark, you use the dark. It's, yeah, whereas on the skin, because it goes red, it's very easy to not.
Fools you into thinking it's darker than it is, doesn't
Yeah.
it? I think everyone can be guilty of that when they first start with black and grey. You overuse your lights, don't you? And don't build up the dark tones enough.
So now that you're putting the shades in, what do you mix between the shades and do wherever you feel, or is there a certain way that you go about doing the shades? Because I notice like now you're moving all around the tattoo.
So, if it were a bigger piece, I'd maybe pick a section. But because it's a fairly small, you know, kind of palm-sized skull, I'm just approaching it all like one section. So what I'm doing first is I'm putting all my light shades in, and if it were real skin, it would be opening up the skin, which makes it easier to blend your dark shades into. It also just gives you a bit of an idea of, you know, where you're putting your tones and different values to start building up that realistic texture and 3D shade.
So you're doing all the lights first?
I'm doing all the lights first at the moment, just opening it up.
And is the parts where you're doing the lights, then you kind of finish it and build it more with the light, or?
So some areas where I know I'm going to darken up, I'll do just a quick pass with the light, and what that would do is it would just open up the skin ready for the darker tones going in. But what I wouldn't want to do is really saturate it with the lights and then go back to it with darker tones, because I would end up overworking the skin. But on the areas that I know are staying pretty light, I will saturate and build up the tones properly.
Do you find having that structure to the way that you do it helps do the tattoo, or do you feel like it changes every piece? I mean, it's going to vary on the different tattoos you do, but
yeah,
in general, is this the way that you'd approach most tattoos?
I'd say in general, yeah. I do mix things up a little bit as I go, but in general, this is how I approach most tattoos.
So you'd map it in, do the lines, put the black areas.
Map it in, do my blacks, like my lines, and my darkest saturated blacks. Maybe do some dark shading / whip shading with the black. and then I'll go straight over to my lights and I'll start building up the different tones and areas of shading. Like I say, spending more time saturating the bits which are going to stay light, and on the bits which I know I'm going to darken, it's more of a quick pass just to open up the skin and create a light tone that I can blend into.
Now, I do very similar to that, and I do find that when I'm tattooing real people, and depending on their skin tone and texture, depends how much of the next shade that I put in. So if I've got the blacks and got the lights in, and like you say about splitting it into thirds with the amount of skin that's left,
yeah,
and depends on the tone of the skin, would depend how much of the next step that I would probably put in. How do you go about that? Would that be the same, or would that be any different?
Yeah, that sounds pretty similar to how I work. So once you've got these lights in, you can visibly see which bits need blended, which bits need to be darker. Sometimes, like there was a tattoo I did the other day of Voldemort off Harry Potter, and his skin in the reference was all kind of textured. You could see all the pores in his skin, which was obviously quite hard to achieve as a tattoo. And I didn't want it to be too smooth. So what I did was I got the tattoo to this stage. I'd done all the blacks and I'd done the lighter shades, and then instead of going back in with my medium and dark tone with a mag and blending to get nice smooth shades, I went back in with my liner, running the machine low, so I was stippling, and I built up those medium and dark tones by stippling it in with the liner instead of using a mag. And what that did was it created a more textured skin tone. You know, the stippling created that effect of pores in the skin, and overall it achieved a much more realistic look than if I was to try and do it smooth, because the reference wasn't smooth. But more often than not, I'll do it like this, and then I'll go back in, normally with a slightly smaller mag, maybe a 7 mag, maybe up to an 11 mag, depending on the size of the piece. With this one it will probably be a 7. And I'll go back in once I've done these lights, and I'll start building up some of the darker tones and blending them. I'll often use stippling over these light tones just to create texture. So like I say, if I want skin that's a bit more textured, it's not really smooth. If I'm doing a portrait and I want to create the effect of stubble, I'll often stipple. Same on animal portraits, when you're doing that really short hair around the nose and the eyes. Sometimes stippling can be a great way to create texture so that your shading's not too smooth. Sometimes, depending on the reference, you know, it can be too smooth, whereas normally with a portrait, that's what you're trying to achieve. You're trying to get it as smooth as possible, really smooth blends. Again with the shading, I'm doing sort of back and forth movements, either whipping out or doing like a pendulum motion. I'm not doing a circular motion. Something else I find helpful, especially when you're trying to achieve that smooth look, is changing the direction. So, for example, you can go back and forth in one direction, and sometimes you'll see your needle marks from the chop. You'll see the needle marks going a certain way. So if you go the opposite way, like cross-hatching with a pencil, it smoothens that out. So that's roughly the stage I would get it to. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick up my 7 mag. This one here is a 13 mag. I'm going to pick up my 7, which is a little bit smaller, and I'm going to go back in and build up some of the more the tones that blend the dark to the light, some of my medium and dark tones, and I can also create a little bit of texture with the smaller mag as I go as well.
So is this the final stage you're on now of the tattoo?
Pretty much. I mean, I guess the true final stage is the white, but I tend to use very limited amounts of white. I don't put much white at all in my black and grey. This is what I'd call, you know, the last stage of the black and grey itself, where I'm just blending tones, making bits a bit darker where they need to be, adding a little bit of texture where it needs it.
So like you said before about, so you've had the black and had the light shade, is this you, like you said, blending the two together, or what is this, what are you doing now?
Yeah, so I'm somewhat blending the two together. I'm looking at my reference, and bits that need to be a little bit darker, I'm darkening up, or I'm adding a little bit of texture. And I'm just chipping my way through it, kind of following my reference, also doing my own thing a little bit where I think it needs it.
So I guess for people who wouldn't know, the black that's there now and you shading over the top, you couldn't do that black afterwards because it wouldn't be there the same, and that's the reason that you put the black there first, isn't it?
Yeah, I like to put it there first because I can make sure it's really saturated and black, whereas if I did it last, I might not go as dark as I should because maybe there's a lot of redness in the skin. I'm worried about overworking it, and usually that'll result in a piece healing lighter than you'd like it to, and the black's not holding up, you know, as dark as you'd intend them to. In this piece, because I don't mind a little bit of texture and a little bit of roughness, I'm purely using my dark shader. I haven't used any medium, and I probably won't use any medium. If I want to achieve more of a medium look, I'll just go over it a little bit faster, a quicker pass with faster hand movements. And if I want to make it a little bit darker, I'll just take my time a little bit more and build up my tones a little bit more saturation, put a little bit more saturation into my tones, and that'll achieve the darkness.
So the depth of the needles, you feel that stays the same on every bit? So
yeah,
regardless of whether it's a light tone or a medium, the depth's always the same?
Yeah, roughly.
It's just your hand movement that changes?
Yeah, mostly hand movement and hand speed. Normally with lining and black, my depth might be a little bit deeper just to get it saturated, but you've got to be careful when you go deeper not to overwork the skin. Sometimes I find if you're packing black, it's easy just to hang your needle out and start hammering it in, but you're often overworking the skin without realising it. And sometimes you should maybe be running a little bit shallower, but just making sure you take the time to saturate it properly.
So in case of the smooth shades, what's your advice on the smooth shades of the tattoo, or building up the shades?
So with the smooth shades, I like to open it up like when I did all my lights, and then when I blend into those, especially on real skin, you really notice that the blends go in a little bit smoother and a little bit easier than if you were to go in straight away with darks. You get less choppiness, the skin gets less angry, it's just easier for blending when you've already opened it up a little bit with your light shades. Whereas if I went straight in with my darks and tried to do all those first, it can be a little bit more rough, a little bit more textured, a little bit more choppy, which sometimes isn't a bad thing. But if I was doing, say, a smooth portrait, I would be trying to achieve the neatest blends possible.
So what are the key tips here throughout this piece? What is the most important tips you think for someone doing this skull tattoo is like the most important few basic tips that you could say?
I recommend starting with the black and putting a lot of focus on the black, getting it in solid, getting it in saturated, getting it in where it needs to be. Very often I'll spend best part of the day, probably around 3/4 of the day doing black, and then the last quarter I'll do shading, or the last third I'll do shading. Some people are the opposite, they'll spend 80% of the day doing shading and then the last 20 doing black. Personally, that doesn't work for me. My heels aren't as good. I don't get my blacks as solid and as saturated. I don't worry if I get 3/4 of the way through my day and I'm still packing black. I don't worry about it.
So it's more about the structure and the build-up of this piece, and then that's what you think is the most important.
Yeah, I think if you get your black solid, if it looks good with just the black, if it's got enough contrast, you're kind of onto a winner. And then the shading you can take your time with, just build up the tones, add a bit here, add a bit there, start blending it a little. But I think that the main focus for me is the black on a piece like this.
And I guess it's quite hard to explain, but with the shading, have you got any key bits of information that you'd recommend for people doing shading, building up the shades, getting it nice, getting that realistic look? Is there any key things that you would point out that you do to make the shading?
Yeah, so if you're using a mag, I recommend back and forth movements, so you're minimising using the edge of the mag as much as possible. When you do circles, you're going to get edges in these parts here, whereas when you do back and forth, you're going to get more of an even blend. And like I say, if you're running a little bit slower or your hand movements are fast, you might notice you get a little bit of chop when you do your shading. You can see the lines going a certain way. Just cross over go the other way, and it will really balance out that blend. A lot like cross hatching with a pencil if you're used to drawing. Always moving, always feathering it in. You never want to sort of pause in the skin and think about what you're doing, because those needles are constantly hammering in and out of the skin, and you can end up overworking an area if you're faffing about. You need to keep your hands moving, and when you do put ink in, put it in with intent. You don't want to faff too much. You want to make sure you're putting it where you want it and you're getting it in right.
Yeah, like you mentioned with the pausing, I think when I very first started learning, and a very good tip that was said to me was thinking about what the needles are doing in the skin.
Yeah.
And that really made me think about the pausing and about what that, like, each individual needle's doing.
Yeah.
And yeah, when you think about what the needles are doing, really changes the way that you treat them on the skin.
You probably notice it most when you're learning to line, and if you pause or if you go too slow, you'll just pack too much into that one area and get a blowout. You always need to keep consistent moving speed, and you've got to imagine like you're making holes in the skin. You're not drawing a line with a paintbrush or a pen. You're making lots of little holes that are joined together. So if you go slow, you're going to be putting loads of holes in a short amount of space. If you go fast, you're going to be spreading those holes out and making them less solid. So you've got to find that perfect medium where you're pulling a consistent movement with your needle and building up those smooth, consistent punctures. So I'm just finishing up the last few bits, a bit of a shadow around the outside just to really make it pop. I'm just softening up the edges. It's a nice blend. I'm really happy with this for my first go on fake skin. It's not exactly like real skin, but it's about as close as you're gonna get as far as learning's concerned. It's a pretty good replica. I'm definitely going to have another go with it in the future. I think it's great for practicing techniques.
Yeah, I'm sure everyone can agree that is absolutely awesome, and all the techniques and shades. Yeah, it's really amazing to watch and get some really good advice from. So is there just the white left after this?
Yeah, and I think I said earlier I don't tend to use much white at all in my realism. I used to use more white. I'd sometimes even almost shade with white and use it for blending and lightening areas and stuff like that, making final adjustments. It's not something I tend to do anymore. I try and get everything as close to bang on as I can with my black and greys, because I feel like they're the parts that are going to last. White ink looks good for photos, but it doesn't tend to stand out much after healing, especially after a few years of healing and a little bit of sun. So I like a tattoo to look good without white, and then I just put in a tiny little bit at the end just to make certain details pop. And that's me.
So he's on the final touches now, just putting the white and details in. It looks absolutely amazing. I'm going to get a nice video of it flat on when he's finished, because at this angle it's quite hard to see. But yeah, you can see on here already how awesome it looks. And huge thanks to Rob for coming on and doing a video. I'm sure a lot of people will be really grateful and see a lot of different techniques on this and stuff like that. So yeah, but follow him up on his Instagram and stuff like that. Hopefully we'll get him back on to doing more videos, and we've already spoke about doing different videos with different people, so there's a lot of exciting projects to come. But yeah, hopefully we'll get him on to do another video soon, maybe a portrait or something like that if he's up for it.
Yeah, so I'm really happy with this for one of my first goes on fake skin. It's been really great to work on. I could probably keep going, adding details for another hour or two. But I think you need to, when you're working on fake skin, you need to be realistic. Treat it a bit like an actual tattoo. You know, you don't wanna overwork it. I could probably add way more white than I would normally add as well, but I'm gonna keep it fairly minimal because I don't like to put a lot of white into my black and grey. I don't find it's something that ages particularly well, so I don't like to rely on it. I think a tattoo should look good without the white, and a little bit of white is just a benefit. As I say, I have enjoyed working on this skin, so I would like to come back and do a little bit more with Luke, explore some other techniques, and do something maybe even more realistic, maybe something portrait style. Not sure how that would come out on fake skin, but it'd be interesting to give it a go. We'll maybe even do a real tattoo at some point on some sorry volunteer, or hopefully not too sorry. Luke's doing a fantastic job with his channel, keeping good content going up just like this, so make sure if you haven't already you give him a follow and subscribe.
I think we've covered quite a lot of questions and techniques and stuff in this video, but if you do have any comments or questions for Rob,
or if there's anything you'd like to see us do in the future,
yeah, hit us up in the comments below, and we'll get onto it. I'll get back to you.